now to our guests in the studio. We have Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Jonathan Conricus, joining us, a former international IDF spokesman. We also have our senior Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran, and our correspondent, Balir Sladin. All right, so I think I'd like to just start with how Israel, the IDF, is essentially weighing the strategic risks right now of continuing operations in Syria and Gaza, especially when these moves risk angering key allies like the United States, as we've just seen. Jonathan?
Yeah, so with Syria, we understand that there are American interests and Israeli interests, and currently they do not match very well. And we saw that with Israel's response last week that reportedly caught the American administration kind of off guard. And what Israel did, which I think we can safely assess that it actually prevented a mass massacre of lots of Druze civilians in Syria by attacking in Damascus, that wasn't really what the American administration was looking for, because they have significant economic interests lined up with big companies in the US waiting for the doors of Syria to open and for a new market to be exploited or to be charted. Israel sees it differently. Israel looks at it from a security perspective and doesn't want jihadists on its border. Coming to the situation in Gaza, as I understand it, Israel is doing two things simultaneously. On one hand, showing additional flexibility and responding to American pressure in the negotiations and actually agreeing to pull out forces more than what has been agreed to before, the famous Morag corridor, and indicating to Hamas that there is an extremely good deal for Hamas to be made and that Israel is willing to do it. On the other hand, and what we're seeing in Deir al-Balach is also signaling to Hamas that if you don't take that deal, then the other option is the military one, maybe actually meaning it for this time and maybe actually going in for a major high-intensity operation against Hamas. I wouldn't say perhaps the last and final operation, but I would say that it possibly could be a high level of operations. And that's where we stand. I think there are tensions between the US and the Israeli perspectives. There's a lot of pressure on Israel to end and to reach that ceasefire, which I think Hamas is leveraging and leveraging very, very cleverly.
Obviously, Israel has put much of the blame on Hamas, saying that it is infiltrating these humanitarian distribution points as well, along with civilians. What is your response to that?
So I think what we're seeing is a coordinated campaign on the ground by Hamas, in the media, by various UN organizations, and the so-called humanitarian information network. They are basically trying to preserve a corrupt model of maintaining Hamas in power. Hamas uses and absolutely needs the so-called humanitarian network in order to stay in power. This is what enabled Hamas to stay in power and to divert so many of their resources over 17 years, not to caring for civilians in Gaza, but for their military buildup. UNRWA is an enabler for Hamas. UNRWA was a facilitator for Hamas's rule, using the humanitarian aid that came in. And many of the UN organizations that are part of the same distribution network are compromised. And I think that what Israel is saying is that this is a system that cannot be allowed to continue to operate.
Right, but the GHF, when it came in, said that the idea was to separate civilians from Hamas, try to make it so that this aid was actually getting into the hands of those who need it most. We've obviously been seeing chaotic scenes on the ground. But I'm interested to hear what you think needs to happen right now to change the situation on the ground and ensure that Gazan civilians are getting the aid that they need in this very dire situation.
Look, I mean, first of all, do all Gazans want a ceasefire right now, no matter what? Absolutely, yes, 100%. And people there, look, they're very savvy. They are fully aware that there is a lot of blame to go around, but they're also very aware of the fact that, Hamas is not the one that is bombing the areas that they live in or the, tents that they're sheltering in places where the IDF told them to go, or the water lines, or impeding access to medical care. And what needs to happen right now truly is what we've been saying all along. Look, this whole narrative of Hamas has infiltrated us and the international organizations and so on and so forth is just I'm sorry, it's ridiculous. We have proven that when we have access to our trucks and when we're able to distribute, just like we did during the ceasefire, we can get aid to the civilians who need it the most. And what we need right now is for the border to open and for those thousands of trucks there to be let in. And I would ask your guests again, why, if the intent is to deprive Hamas of financial revenue, does Israel not then just flood Gaza with aid?
That isn't the intent. It's not about financial revenue. It's about depriving Hamas of the tool to continue to oppress the Palestinian population. That is the intent. Not necessarily the money, but it's the ability to continue to govern Gaza. And we know that Hamas, through organizations that claim to be humanitarian and claim to be there for the greater good and to alleviate suffering of Palestinians, what in fact they are doing is aiding and abetting Hamas's oppression of Palestinians by helping aid go through the hands of Hamas. And then Hamas uses that as leverage to continue to dominate the population. That is the sad reality. And I think what has been proven clearly for anybody who is objective and honest enough to look at it is that humanitarian organizations are a terrible, horrible failure in Gaza. They have totally not delivered on their duties. They are in bed with Hamas, and instead of actually caring for the needs of Palestinians, they're protecting a terrorist organization that is oppressing them.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to move on to our next topic. I'd like to thank Arwa for joining us so much. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a heavy accusation to level against us and not let me respond to. Because to say that, we're somehow aiding and abetting Hamas is just ridiculous. Look, I've been to Gaza.
UNRWA isn't aiding and abetting Hamas?
I've been to Gaza 4 times since October 7th. And when you drive around Gaza, you don't see Hamas. Hamas is not controlling anything above ground in any of the major civilian areas. I don't understand how you even derive the sort of logic that Hamas has somehow infiltrated aid
Clearly,
organizations.
you haven't been in any of the areas where Hamas is applying pressure tactics, is killing, is executing, is beating Palestinians.
In areas where the vast majority of the civilian population is located, where we as humanitarian organizations work. And I would add that for a reason that was not disclosed to me, I was denied entry back into Gaza in March, and that there has been a 40% increase in denials when it comes to people that are trying to go on humanitarian and medical missions. We do not work or move in the red zone. You know this perfectly well. We are not permitted to move around the red zone, and more than 80% of Gaza
and as such, I think that your understanding of what's happening in Gaza and of Hamas's rule is limited because you are limited to certain areas where perhaps Hamas is less in power. But the other areas is where Hamas governs, and it governs by the force of the weapon. That is how Hamas governs.
Yes, that we're not going to dispute. But I am moving, humanitarian organizations are moving around the areas where the civilian population is concentrated and where the humanitarian aid is being distributed, not the red zone.
All right.
Well enough.
Okay. We're going to have to turn to our next topic. Arwa, thank you for joining us. We still have our guests in studio sticking with us.